you've been following me for a while, you should be making connections in your head, right? I wrote my dissertation on state ideology. The largest lecture series that I've done is Nietzsche's Will to Power, and I begin my lecture series, advanced lecture series on political theory, with Lasky's statement immediately that the state is based upon will. I'll leave it at that. With history behind us, we are compelled to conclude that no such will can, by definition, be good. No such will, by definition, can be good. Right? So that when we're talking about the will, and we're talking about the will of the state, this will of the state, oops, I forgot Cobra was up here. Cobra, you can't stick around for this lecture series, I'm sorry, this is even too advanced for you, Cobra. Especially you, Cobra. Alright, so when we're talking about the will, and we're talking about the will of the state, right? The state is based on, the foundation of the state is based on will, then we recognize that insofar as we're talking about the will, it immediately becomes paradoxical to suggest that the will is based on goodness, right? That in an Aristotelian sense, that the state is directed towards the good, right? So if the state is based on will, and we make the assumption that the will is directed towards the good, and this is not going to be true, and we make the assumption that the will is directed toward the good, then the obvious syllogism that you can follow, which I don't need to write because this is the advanced theories, is that the state is directed towards the good. The problem, however, with making the assumption that the state is directed towards the good is that in terms of goodness, we need, right? And the question would be, good for whom, right? Good for whom? Right? And this becomes the problem. Insofar as we attempt to assess the actions and motivations of the state, and we do so in terms of goodness, then we recognize an initial problem, right? So, again, with history behind us, we are compelled to conclude that no such will can, by definition, be a good will. And the individual must, therefore, whether by himself or in concert with others, the individual must, by himself or in concert with others, pass judgment upon its validity. Pass judgment upon its validity. At this point, the question is, well, what is the validation? Right? The validation, right? There is an attempt by the state, arguably, to validate the concept of the good. Right? And this is any state abstractly in general, right? There is, and this is going to be advanced. And I can't really apologize because I've warned you, right? This is going to be advanced. So with respect to the state, the validation becomes by the individual acting by him or herself, or a concert of individuals acting as mass, right? The individual or the mass in relationship to the state. The question they pose to the state is the validation, of the state's motivation, the state's will towards goodness, right? It is the individual that asks, for whom is this good directed? It is the mass that asks, obviously theoretically, for whom is this good directed? That challenge, that question is proposed to the state in an attempt to force the state to validate the notion of goodness, right? So there is a sense in which the individual recognizes, and I'm actually writing on this right now, there is a sense, this is why I started with this, right? There is a sense, because I'm going to come back and watch myself talk, there is a sense in which the validation that the population at large require of the state, if the state assumes the position, and this is a huge if, right? If the state assumes the position that political will is directed towards goodness, there needs to be a justification to the population of what that means. What does it mean by good, and for whom are we talking about? Whose benefit are we talking about, right? So that applies to many, many different types of states, many different forms of state governance. I'm interested in absolutely none of them. I just want to throw that out in its most general, sort of densely complex, and you make sense of what you want to make sense of, right? In a more advanced lecture series, and this is what graduate education really is about, is to give you the foundational understanding, and I recognize that this is going to be conceptually difficult, so that you can make your own assessments, right? So I'm not going to try and bias the argument, and that's the one thing I want to say. If you already know what monistic state is and a pluralistic state is, if you already know what anarchy is and all the technical fancy words are, I would ask you to sort of set aside everything that you've learned up until this point and just come with an open mind. You will need to have that foundational understanding of all the complex terms and what they mean and the relationships and blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go into that now. But if I say, in a very technical sense, that the individual, and this is not really me, this comes from Lasky himself, right? Since he says that the individual or the group of individuals working in concert are justified in a sense, mandating the state to validate the assumption that its will is directed towards the good, you need to know what that means. You need to know what the signification of that is. Why is that important? I can't get into it now because there's so many different importances, and in an advanced lecture I don't want to particularize. I don't want to instantiate at all. I want to remain general for the whole analysis, which is complex. But I've been waiting to do a series like at this level for a while, so I'll do at least the first hour, and then I'll get a vibe before I go on with the second hour, because if it's just too out there, then, and it's not going to be out there like some of the more out there lectures that I've done privately at the university. But as far as YouTube and free education goes, it's guided by the author. Don't take my word, take the author's word, but the interpretations will be much quicker. My pace is going to be a lot quicker in this series. So, whether by himself or in concert with others, pass judgment upon the validity, examining its substance. Right? There is judgment that's being passed. The population, and this is the population. The population as mass, or individuals within the population, want the state to validate this assumption, or this consequence, right? The consequence. Is this where we're going? This is the telos, if you will. Right? This is the telos, I mean really in Aristotelian terms, and he will chastise Aristotle later. And he specifically, Lasky, will chastise Aristotle for precisely this point later, but nevertheless, the population is justified in asking the state to validate it, right? And this judgment then, right, this judgment holds the state accountable. The whole point of passing judgment, as he says, passing judgment upon the validity, right? And it's a very, very complex idea, right? It comes across as though it were simple, but it's anything but simple, right? The question then becomes, what are the mechanisms in which the individual, which is far more difficult, or a concert of individuals passes judgment on the validity of the state's telos, right? What are the mechanisms with which an individual or a group of individuals pass judgment on the state's telos, if that telos is the good, right? So the question then becomes, how do we do that? How does the population do that, right? How does the population pass judgment? So, just for a visual recognition, we'll have the state here, right, as sort of amorphous superstructure, okay, and we'll have the population here. We'll have the population as a group, which we'll identify as mass, just in general, and we'll have the individual. Okay, so we recognize that there is a relationship between the individual and the group, and in a very nuanced sense, the individual is, by definition, set aside, stands apart from the group.